How does state really work in React.js? Well, in today's video, you're going to learn just that. You're going to learn about the useState hook and what state is, and we're going to show some examples along the way. So I'm going to link this kind of starter project in the description below. If you want to follow along, you can just use git clone to clone this repo and then run npm install in your code editor of choice, and you can follow along here. But to start here, state is a component's memory. It represents the current data on a dynamic page. So what does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? Well, we'll of course show what it looks like, but I think it also helps to show what this doesn't look like. So for example, we have this counter button here that shows the current count. And I'm going to open up our console, go to console, I'm going to clear it. And if we go to VS Code here within this project, you're going to see I have this component or this function called React State. I set a global variable, let count is equal to 0. And then this is where I render how does state really work in React. And then our count button with the current count. And that displays our count variable right here. And when we click on this button, we call this handle increment function on this onClick, which is this function right here. It should increment the count. So plus equals 1. So increments the count by 1. And then also in the console, it's going to console.log the current count. What you would expect is if we click on this button, it's going to increment the count, and then it's going to show the current count right here on the page. So let's go ahead and see if this works. So I'm going to click on this. You can see it doesn't change what we see on the page, but the values in the console are actually showing the incremented number. So we see all these numbers going up, but it's not showing on the page. So what's going on here? Well, this component, it's not getting its memory updated. It's not being representative of the current value in this dynamic page. By dynamic, I mean that the user can interact with this page and the values of this page can change. So if the data on a page can change and those changes can occur over time, then this is a dynamic page and it's going to need to use some sort of memory for this component. So it remembers what the current data of the page is. Because if it has no way of remembering the current data of this page, it's not going to be able to show the user the correct page that it should see for the current UI. And this memory is state. So the state of our web page right here is a count of 0. But how can we make sure that the state updates and actually shows what our current count should be? Well, a lot of people would say you should just, use a JavaScript variable and update that variable. Well, we can see here that this doesn't work. React doesn't work that way because in React, you need to use something called a hook that allows you to, when you update a variable, it actually re-renders this part of the web page and it shows the updated variable. So the way that we can actually do this in React and we can add state to this component is we need to use the useState hook from React. So to do this, I'm going to get rid of, we'll keep handle increment for now, but in the body of this function, we're going to say const state is equal to useState. And we are going to import that from React. So import useState from React, and we're going to call this function. Now, there's a couple of things that you should know about useState. For one, you can only call a React hook, which is useState. And generally, a hook is a function that React is going to give you from its library. It's going to be a function that you get out of the box in React, and you can import that into your components. But it's going to be a function that allows you to hook into React features. And these features of React are going to be things like state and using effects and using references to variables. And we'll cover this stuff as we go. But hooks are just functions that you get from the React library. They're functions that you get out of the box that you can use within your application to allow you to hook into React features. So we're using this useState hook, and it's just a function from React that is going to allow us to use the feature of React called state, which state, it's going to allow us to have components have some sort of data over time or some memory of data. So we can have this changing data over time. And this could be for account, it could be for text inputs, it could be a whole bunch of stuff. And we'll show you a to-do list later on just to show you another example. But we call this useState hook. But what we need to remember is that when we call the useState hook, we're going to call it with an initial default value. So we're going to initialize our count to 0. So we're going to initialize useState with 0. So we're going to call it with that value. And now let's just console.log our state to see what that looks like, to see what useState returns. And if we see state right here, and I open this up, you see it returns an array to where the first value of this array is 0, which is the value that we initialized useState with, or we called useState with. And then the second value is a function. So what useState returns here is an array of 2 values. The first value is going to be your current state, which we initialized it to 0. And then the second value is going to be a function to update your current state. And what you will commonly see this written as is instead of just saying like const state is equal to useState, you will see people automatically destructure the first and second values from useState. So it will actually look more like this. I will destructure using square brackets the current value, which I'm going to call count, and then the second value I'm going to call set count. So useState returns an array of 2 values, the current state and a way to set the state or update the state. And we are automatically destructuring those values using JavaScript destructuring syntax to get to the current count and a way to set the count. And I'm going to remove this counter here. And I'm also going to remove this console.log statement. So now we have our count and set count functions, but instead of just setting our count like this, we now want to use our set count function. So I'm going to say set count. Well, how should I do this here? Should I just say it's count plus 1? Well, a better way to do this is when you are using the state setter function from useState, you can either call that state setter function with just like an absolute value. So I could set the count to 4, or I could set the count to 10. And that's going to update the state to whatever value I pass in here. But sometimes you want to set the state based off the previous state. And anytime you want to do that, it's actually best to pass a function to your state setter function. So here, I'm going to pass an anonymous function, and it's going to give us the previous count as an argument automatically. And then I'm going to set the current count to the previous count plus 1. So what we're doing here is we are passing a function to this setter function return from useState. We're passing a function into it, and React is automatically going to pass our previous count to that function. And then we want to just return our updated state based on our previous state. And in this case, we want our updated state to be our previous state, our previous count, plus 1. And now, if I click this button here, you see we are getting our updated state. And I'm going to clear my console, and then you can see our console now matches what we're seeing here. And the reason this works is because when you use this state setter function, that is automatically going to tell React that it needs to re-render this part of the page. because you set a new piece of state, so you need to re-render this component. So anytime you set state in React, it is going to re-render this component, which is going to give the updated value to the page, which is now going to allow this component to show this updated data over time, or to kind of remember the current data of the application or the current state of this page. One thing that's important to understand about state and components in general is that each component is going to have its own independent private state. So the way I'm going to show you this is we're going to create a new file, and it's just going to be called count component.jsx. And technically speaking, we are working within a Next.js application, but to make this just be React, just put use client at the top of the page. It's going to just make this a React component here, but that's a Next.js specific thing. What I'll do is I'm going to say export default function count component. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take this button right here, and we are going to return that in this component. We're going to return this button. And then we're also going to take this logic right here. We're going to copy it, and we are going to paste it here, and make sure that you import state from React, or import useState from React. And then I'm going to remove this console log here because we don't need it anymore. But now we've created our own count component. So within this page, we can remove all this logic here. And instead of hard coding this button, we can just render our count component. And if I didn't mess anything up, we should see that we have the same exact user experience here to where we see this. However, like I was saying earlier, each component has its own independent private state. So if I render another count component here on this page, what you're going to see is now I have one counter that has the count of 9 and another counter with a count of 0. And I can increment these independently of each other. So they have their own private state here, because in React, this component is going to have its own private state, and so is this component. So each component can separately remember their current data or their current values. So just keep in mind that each component is going to have its own private state. Even if you render the same component twice on the page, those components don't really know of each other. And when I update the state in this count component, that is the only thing that's going to re-render on this page, is this component is going to re-render. But then if I update this count component, that component is going to re-render. And they don't really know of each other on this page. Those are the only sections of this page that are now going to be re-rendering. So each component is going to have its own private state, even if you render the same component twice on the page. So now that you kind of know what state is, how the useState hook works, and some other principles of using state in React, a good test for you is if you can now create a to-do list. So basically just a list of text that when you have an input, they can type in the input, they can select add to do, and it is going to add a to do to the page. And for the sake of this, maybe don't worry about deleting to-dos. Maybe I'll do that in my example. I'm not sure yet. It's going to be a surprise, but see if you can build that. But I'm going to move on and build that right now. So if we want to add to-dos on this page, well, what I can do is we can create our own to-do component. So what I'm going to do here is do a new file, and I'm going to say to-do component.jsx. We're going to say it's a use client. Just put that at the top of your files for now, just to make sure everything is just basic React here, client-side React. But I'm going to say export default function to do component. And what are we going to need here? Well, we're going to need a to-do list that we're going to update. So this page, it's going to have an input to add a to-do, and then a to-do list. So we're going to need const to-do list, comma, set to-do list is equal to useState, and we're going to initialize it as an array. And that's an important thing as well. You can initialize useState with numbers, strings, arrays, objects, really whatever you want is what you can initialize it with. So we're going to initialize our to-do list as just an empty array. And then we have our set to-do list function. Now, we're also going to want, and let me also import useState from React. What we're also going to want is we're going to want to have an input on this page that the user can type into and add a to-do. So we're going to say const to-do input and set to-do input is equal to useState. And I'm not really going to worry about styling at all right now. We're just going to render an ugly component onto our page. And I think that's going to be just fine. But what should we initialize this as? Well, I think it's going to be best to initialize it as a string. So we're going to initialize our to-do input as a string. And now we need to return. Well, what do we need to return? I'm just going to return a wrapper div. But then in this div, I'm going to render an input that is going to be of type text. And we are going to say that the value is equal to our to-do input. And then for the on change of this input, we're going to pass an inline function in which we're going to set the to-do input. We're going to accept the event here, and we're going to set the to-do input to be the event.target.value. And I think that's all we're going to need for that. But then we're going to have a button here that's going to say add to do. When we do an on click for this button, what we're going to want to do is I'm going to pass an inline function as well. You could, of course, put these in their own functions up top here, and maybe that would actually look better in this case. But what we want to do is we want to set the to-do list with our new to-do. But we want our to-do list to be our previous to-do. So we're passing in a function to our set to-do list. And we want to make sure we return an array where we spread our previous to-dos, but we add our new to-do. Our new to-do is just going to be our value of our to-do input. So we have our input that is going to set our to-do input to be our event.target.value. And then we have our button that is going to set our to-do list when we click the add to-do button. And it's going to set it to be our previous to-dos. And it's going to return an array with our previous to-dos. But then it's going to have our new to-do in here as well. I'm going to open up curly braces. And we're going to take our to-do list. We're going to map over it, accept a to-do, and then we are going to return, I don't know, maybe I'll just return, I should return LIs here, so I guess I'll do that. And we'll render our to-do list within an unordered list here, and I'll move this up. I thought about just doing it with an array of like spans or something, which would also be fine, but probably not the right thing to do. And we'll just render the to-do within an LI, and then we'll just set the key. We don't have an ID. We might add one in a second, but we'll just set the key to be a to-do right now. I think this might work. Let's go check. Let's remove one of our count components, and I'm going to now render my to-do list or my to-do component within our home page, which is called React State here. And if we come back, I'm going to close my console. We see our beautifully styled input. And I'm going to type in something to do, but I don't see anything because I think my text is white and my input is white. So let's actually add some styles here. So to do component, input, I'm going to just do style, and I'm going to set color is black, right? Yeah, that'll fix it. Okay. Something to do, and I'm going to click add to do, and hey, we added a to do. Now, one thing that we could do here is after we add a to do, we could also clear our text input. So for add to do here, I I'm going to actually create a function called handle add to do. And we are going to take this logic where we're going to set our new to-do list like so. So set to-do list to be previous to-dos, return an array of all of our previous to-dos plus our new to-do. But then we're also going to set our to-do input to just be an empty input. So we're going to clear our input, and then on add to do, we'll just call this function instead. So now if I add another to do, you see it adds the to do here as well, but it clears the input, which is probably what we want here. And you can also see that our count button still works independently of our to-do list because our two components have two separate pieces of state, something to do 3, and all this is working well. Now, what if we wanted to delete a to-do? Well, we could do that fairly easily here. I'll show you this quick. What we can do is when we add a to-do, we probably want our to-dos to have some sort of ID. So we're actually going to make our to-dos an object in which we're going to say our text is equal to our to-do input, but then we're going to set our ID. We're just going to take the easy route and do math.random and make it a little bit hacky right now. You probably wouldn't want to do this in an actual application, but for now it's fine. But each to-do now is going to be an object that has a text and ID property. And then we're going to render our to-do.text. But our key is going to be our to-do.id here. We also want to render, so instead of just rendering a list item, we will render our to-do.text, and then we'll also render a button that just has an X, and then our on click is going to be handle delete to do, but we're going to want to pass our to-do ID. So I'm going to pass an anonymous function that's going to be handle delete to do, and we're going to pass our to-do.id, and I'm going to create a function called handle delete to do, and then it's going to take an ID. And then what we need to do is we need to set our to-do list to be our previous to-do list without the to-do with this ID. So we want to pass a function here. So we get our previous to-dos, and then we want to return our previous to-dos dot filter. I'm going to accept a to-do, and I'm going to say to-do.id is not equal to our passed in ID. So basically return an array, because the filter method on an array returns an array. Return an array where we filter in every to-do that is not equal to the ID that we pass for handle delete to do, which should be the to-do with an X right here. So I think this should work here. I don't know what's going on here. We did to-do.text here, which I need to refresh this because when I initially added my to-dos, I didn't add them with an object here. So I'm going to just refresh this page to clear the state, but I'll say add to-do 1. So we see it now. To-do 2, add to-do. And if I click the X, it gets rid of the right to-do. Let's just add a few more to-dos just to make sure I'm correct here. And we should be able to add specific to-dos, and we can. And that looks like it's working correctly. So hopefully that example helped. Let's recap what we just went over here today. So state is going to be a component's memory, and it represents the current data of a certain component. And it helps you create dynamic web pages. So the user can click on these values, it can add different things to the page. And then this component right here, it remembers and it updates based on what the kind of user tells it to do, and it shows the current data of the page. Same thing with this count component. And a regular variable isn't going to work. A regular JavaScript variable isn't going to work because you're not telling React to update the page with the current new state or the current new data. So it's best to use the useState function from React, in which This is a hook, which is just a function from React that is going to allow you to hook into React features. In this case, useState is going to allow you to use the state feature of React, in which when you call this function, you call it with the default value that you want your state to be. And this can be a string, a number, an array, an object, a Boolean. And then from there, it's going to return an array of 2 values. The first is going to be your current state, and the second is going to be a way to update your state. And every time you update your state, it is going to re-render that component so it shows the updated value on the page. So I click my count component, and it's going to re-render this count component with the updated state. And when you call this state setter, you can either call it with just an absolute value like we're doing here, setting the to-do input to be just a string, or you can call it with a function in which React is going to pass as an argument to that function the previous state, and then you can use the previous state to then return the new updated piece of state based on your previous state. And then finally, each component is going to have its own isolated piece of state. So even if you render the same component multiple times on the page, like rendering this count component multiple times on the page, we can use these components independently of each other because each component is going to have its own independent private piece of state. So hopefully this video helps you out with understanding state in React. I know it's kind of a lot, but this is one of the very core concepts of React. So hopefully this helps. Thanks for tuning into it, and I'll see you in that next one.